This episode is brought to you in part by Samply. Samply makes the process of dealing with mix revision notes super easy. Make sure to check them out online at samply.app. And while you're there, get 3 months off any plan free by simply using the coupon code MYM at checkout. Hey, welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast. My name is Mike Indovina, and thanks for hanging out with me today. Today, my guest is Dave Cerminara, and if you're not familiar with Dave, Dave is a producer, recording engineer, mixing engineer who has worked with a ton of great artists, including Father John Misty, Health, Phosphorescent, and a whole bunch more. In today's episode, we dive deep into Dave's process as far as getting mixes that have vibe and clarity. If you listen to any of his mixes, you'll notice that he does a great job with getting his vocals to stand out right in front of the mix and have a lot of clarity to them. But not only that, his mixes often feel very big and immersive, and you feel like you're in the mix, not just listening to something in front of you. So, I was really intrigued to learn more about his process on how he goes about doing that. And in this interview, we talk about everything from setting your levels, setting your effects, some of his philosophies on how to process instruments and all that kind of stuff. And I think that if you take a lot of the advice that he shares in this episode here, you're going to gain a lot of new tips that will help you get that clarity in your own tracks and make your mixes feel really big and immersive. So with that said, let's just jump right into the interview. Dave Cerminara, thank you so much for being on the MasterYourMix podcast. What's going on, man?
Thank you for having me. Doing well.
Yeah, well, thanks for being on. For people who might not be familiar with you, can you give us a little background on who you are, what you do, ultimately how you got into music production?
Sure. I'm a producer, mixer, engineer. I work on records when people ask, I generally just say I work on records for a living. I live in Pasadena now, but originally from Pittsburgh, and I've been out here for 10 years and been working on records in some capacity or another for coming up on like 15 years, which feels crazy to say that I'm still doing it and actually making a living doing it feels wild. Yeah, I mean, couldn't have asked for anything more. But yeah, I've been doing it since college, basically.
That's amazing. How did you get started with music? Like what ultimately got you into it in the first place?
Kind of the tale as old as time. Like grew up playing guitar, playing in bands in high school, and then got really into, when I started college, got really into, it was like when Ableton was really starting to pop off. And I was really into electronic music and into a lot of that stuff, and got into Ableton, and that was kind of my first foray into actual recording. Like before recording like band kind of stuff or guitar music, it was doing like figuring out Ableton and just making beats like everyone does when they're 17, 18 years old. And then that ultimately led to, I was still playing in bands throughout college and playing guitar in different bands. And the school where I went, there wasn't a music tech program or anything like that. I went to University of Pittsburgh, so there wasn't like a recording program or anything, but there was a radio station that had like a little console and a Pro Tools rig, and I started recording that way because I started working at the radio station. I just became the guy in the band that had like the key access to the studio and like a couple, MXL microphones and whatever. That was kind of the start of it. It started off as me just really being into like Ableton and laptop stuff. And then it was like, well, someone has to record vocals. So I'm the guy with the card. So I started doing that. That was like, I was, maybe 19 or 20. And then I was in a band throughout college, and we got to go to Philly to go to like a real studio to record with a friend of ours who was engineer there. And that was my first like real recording experience. And it was kind of like everybody has that moment. Everybody on every podcast talks about like their moment, whether it was like with a Tascam or whatever. That was the one for me, going to like a real studio and being like, oh, well, I don't want to leave here. This is the coolest thing ever. I had no idea what anything did. I didn't know what a compressor was, any of that stuff, but I was just like so infatuated with the process. And like I said, I wasn't going to school for it or anything, so it was just having that experience at whatever it was, 20 or 21, like halfway through college, and going like, all right, I'm doing this. This is the thing for me.
That's awesome. So it sounds like it was like a lot of kind of trial and error to pick up the process and, just work with what you had there.
Oh, 100%. Like when I was starting with the whole like having access to the radio station, I remember like, I'm playing in this band. We were going to record some songs, and showing up that, we set up to like record, had no idea. I remember the singer of the band bringing up, he was like, we need to check phase. And I was like, what is phase? I don't even know what that means. So we did that, and then going to like a real studio to do it and just experiencing the difference it was so mind blowing. It was like, there's this whole world of stuff that there's so much that I don't know that I need to learn. But I think everybody either has that experience or should have that initial experience of like knowing virtually nothing and going in and trying to record songs that you wrote with your friends, if for no other reason to learn how goddamn hard it is. You know what I mean? Like like how difficult it is to like you're in like some, basement band writing songs that sound away in your head, and then you're like, oh, we'll just go record them, piece of cake. And it's terribly difficult. So I'm glad that I had, I came at it more from that angle as opposed to going to school and like learning techniques or learning phase or, any technical stuff. I just came at it as like someone who was really into electronic music on one hand, making Ableton stuff, and more or less like learning how compressors or EQs work via that. And then at the same time playing in a band, doing that whole thing, touring, and like, okay, now I need to record a real drum set. And why does it sound so terrible when I do it? And why does it sound so good when we go to Philadelphia and do it at a real studio, like on a Neve, So then from there, after college, just started working at a couple studios around Pittsburgh. A couple studio owners were like really gracious to me and like really opened their doors. Cause like I said, I had no like resume as like with a background in music tech or any of that stuff. I was just always working on music with friends and different friend groups. So I got really lucky working at these couple studios in Pittsburgh. They both gave me keys, and then I was just like off to the races on my own. Just like I said, I was touring at the time, just like regionally, and so you go to Philly or DC or Jersey and play a basement show and meet people, and come to Pittsburgh. I work at this studio. Let's do something overnight for like a weekend. And then it just became that. And I did that for more or less like, I guess 3 years in Pittsburgh before we finally moved out west. And that's the whole origin story. Yeah.
That's amazing. I definitely agree with you. I think a lot of people have that similar experience of like being in the studio, or at least you should, because like you can always learn something. Like I still feel like to this day, even if I'm doing my own band stuff, like I want to work with another producer. I want to be in a studio that isn't mine. Like there's so much I can learn from that experience. And if it doesn't sound great, I know how to do it. That's fine. But like I want to learn from other people and see how they do it and like learn their processes. That's part of the reason why I have the podcast, right? It's just like meet new people and see what their process is. And it might be totally different than mine, but that's awesome.
Yeah, and had I not had that, I think about that a lot. Had I not had that experience of going, the studio in Philly was called Milk Boy, and it was like like a Neve room and whatever. I didn't know what a Neve was, but I knew that it was like, oh, this thing's expensive. Had I not had that experience, I have no idea. I don't know what I probably would have gone to law school. Probably been an easier life, honestly, but not nearly as fun, I guess. But I think one of the biggest takeaways I got from that experience, seeing like a real schooled engineer for the first time, was how fast it was our friend Carl, and seeing how fast Carl was at Pro Tools, like, boggled my mind. And to me, I was kind of like, oh, that's what I need to get good at that too. Like, it's one thing to know microphones or gear and all that stuff, but like, he's so good because he can just make stuff happen fast. He can audition ideas so quickly. And that really stayed with me. And not that that is like the end all be all skill set, but it proved in my situation really valuable when I did ultimately come to LA, because that was sort of like how I got work. Like, I would work with different producers and they would recommend me to other people. And it was like, oh, just get Dave. He's so fast. Like, and I don't think I realized even back then how important that was for someone coming out here, virtually no credits. I was just like cold calling producers and trying to get gigs that way. And that ended up helping me a lot. And again, I wouldn't have come to that at all had it not been for that experience when I was 20 years old in
Absolutely.
Philly.
Yeah, I love that. I think that is something that is really not appreciated as much as like that focus on speed. And I have a similar story too. Like, I remember like the first time I saw like a real editor work in front of me and like seeing how fast they were. And I remember like the guy came in with his own mouse because it had like keyboard shortcuts macroed to it. And like,
yeah,
and then he was talking about all these like macro programs he was using. And I was like, what? Like, you can do that? And it blew my mind how fast he was. And it just made me realize, like, okay, like if I want to be a professional like this guy, I have to step it up. I have to learn this stuff and always be thinking of optimizing and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. At this point, it feels almost like a prereq, right? It's like not. Whenever I moved out here and I started getting that thing of like different producers recommending me to other people because of the speed, there was like a cynical part of me that was like resentful of it, because I was like, man, I'm not just like a gamer dude who's like fast on a mouse. Like, I to me, like, the arrogant part of me is like, oh, I have good taste too, and like I'm good, but you're in a huge city that's highly competitive with a ton of people that want to be doing this job. You need something. You need something to get your foot in the room. Yeah, a big part of it for me was just being quick at Pro Tools.
Yeah. So you eventually moved from Ableton into Pro Tools.
Yeah. Like I said, when I was in college, like, definitely Ableton was the thing that got me into the process in the first place. Like, listening to electronic music. And it was that time when like any MIDI controller you bought at Guitar Center just like came with Ableton for free. So I just had it from that, like, high school, college. But then, yeah, when it transitioned into, like I said, going to this university radio station and recording, then it was Pro Tools. And then going to that studio for the first time, and it was like all Pro Tools. At that point, I was like, I need to learn. I need to be really fast in this. It's a shame because I still use Ableton, not nearly as much. But if I'm working on something in like a project's in Ableton, or I'm working on a record now that everything's starting in Ableton, and I'll often try to just keep it there. And I feel like because I've spent so much time in the past decade working in Pro Tools, now I go back to Ableton, which at 17, I was like a whiz, or I felt like a whiz. And now I feel like such an old man, just like, trying to go backwards, after a decade working in Pro Tools. But I still try to bounce. There's things that it can do that are seemingly very difficult still in Pro Tools, frustratingly enough. But yeah, that was kind of how that again, that first trip to a real studio was kind of that point for me where I was like, I have to, if I'm going to do this, this is how I got to do it.
Absolutely. So with that focus on speed, then, like, what were some of the things that you were doing to like help you work faster? Or like, what advice would you have for anyone who's maybe kind of still feeling like they're pretty slow at this? What kind of things should they be looking into?
The most boring advice, which is just like, look up like your key commands and like memorize them. And when new stuff comes out, new either updates or just different shortcuts, whatever in Pro Tools, just try to learn them and commit them to like muscle memory. as quickly as you can. Because like, yeah, I think if you're young, if you're trying to land like engineering gigs or whatever, and you need a leg up, that's certainly going to help. Just being fast. People want stuff efficiently. It like, you got to be good at so many other things. Like, it has to sound good. You need to know how stuff works. That's like, that's the prereq at this point. It's like knowing how to use a computer or send an email. Like, you have to know that stuff. So then from there, it becomes all the other variables, I think. And it, like I said, it certainly helped me, and it got me in a lot of rooms out here or on a lot of sessions with a lot of great people that I might not have otherwise had the opportunity to work with. And in that case, I probably wouldn't be here talking to you. So
yeah, I totally agree with that. I think the keyboard shortcuts, it's like the least sexy thing to learn, but it makes you so much faster.
It's so lame to talk about. It really, I'll be the first to admit it. It's dorky as hell, but it matters. It makes a difference for me now. Kind of where I'm at, it still matters, but I'm not going after those same sorts of gigs, so it's less crucial. But yes, starting out, wildly important.
And it just seems impressive when you know what you're doing. I remember one of my first studio gigs after I graduated from music school was like in a post studio. And I remember the engineer, he was kind of half joking when he said this. He's like, I just tap random things on the keyboard all the time because it makes the clients feel like I know what I'm doing.
I know. I think there's the part of me in the back of my head that whenever I do see like the real like engineering hands going, and it looks like a cat tapping a keyboard, they're just like doing this. And it looks absurd. There's nothing cool about that.
Yeah. I just think of like that South Park episode, the World of Warcraft one, where they're just like sitting back, just tapping like crazy on their keyboard.
It's that, or I like to think of the girl in Jurassic Park when she's like, I'm a hacker. And then she just does this a bunch. It sounds like that.
Yeah.
But hey, it matters, and it's part of the world we're in now. It's no different than 30 years ago, if you could rip a tape edit super fast.
Of course.
It mattered. It mattered.
Yeah, I'd even recommend too, like for people who are getting into keyboard shortcuts for the first time, it's like, there's so many like keyboard, you could buy keyboards that have all the shortcuts like mapped out on all the keys for you, or you can get stickers, or like there's like little overlays you can get. Like stuff like that is so key to like just help you commit that stuff to memory faster, and eventually you don't need that stuff anymore. But like it's good when you're just getting started to like realize what options are in front of you on your keyboard and how to make the most out of it.
Yeah. I mean, anything, people want to work fast. People want, if you're in a production session, it's got to move quickly and seamlessly. If you're the engineer, you need to just facilitate stuff happening as quickly as possible and kind of make the technical side as invisible as possible in some ways. So yeah, it was, in my experience, that helped me whenever I first moved to LA, just to like bounce around. So
yeah,
and get work. And I always said like moving out here was like my biggest thing was just like not get a real job. Like I'll do whatever I can to like not have to have like a real job in addition to working on records. And that was one of those things that early on when I was making like nothing a day, but I was busy enough because of those recommendations. I was doing it. Yeah, I was in it. Yeah. I was like 25. I was living in Los Angeles. I was stoked. Yeah, I was so happy, especially coming from a place like Pittsburgh where, it's not a music town. It's a small place. It was an excellent place to cut my teeth. And again, like playing in bands, everybody in the community very quickly. You also end up working with everybody in the community in like 18 months time, So yeah, you hit that threshold for me, pretty early, 24, 25 years old. And that was when it was like, okay, if I'm going to keep doing this on a greater scale, I think it's time to split.
Hey, just want to take a quick second to tell you all about our awesome podcast sponsor, Samply, which is an app that I've been using for a while now that has made the process of mix revisions with clients so much easier. In the past, I used to get vague emails from clients about what sections needed fixing, and it was always a bit of a guessing game. But with Samply, I can upload my mixes, send my clients a link to a playlist where they can listen losslessly, and then they can add timestamped comments directly on the files. I can then import these notes into my DAW and have them perfectly synced up to my session, so there's no more guessing. Another feature that I love is their playlist embedding. Right now on my website, I have a lossless playlist of my portfolio so that any potential client can hear my work at full quality. No more crappy sounding, low resolution MP3 files. Instead, people can hear my work at its best. And the icing on the cake? Samply integrates with a ton of different services. And one of my favorite integrations is their integration with SoundFlow. With just one click, Samply can export my mix from my DAW, upload it to Samply, and then send my clients an email for where they can hear their song. One button, that's all it takes. It's a major time saver. So Samply has really streamlined my workflow, and I know that they can do it for you too. So make sure to check them out online at samply.app. And you can get 3 months off any Samply plan for free by simply applying the coupon code MYM at checkout. Well, one of the things I had read about you was that one of your pieces of advice that you tend to give new people in this industry is to say yes to everything. I don't know if you still feel that way.
Did I say that?
I read that in an article somewhere.
I think that was a real young and optimistic me. No, I absolutely still think that. Absolutely.
Well, why do you think that is? Why is that so important for people to say yes to everything, especially in those early days?
Because in the early days, because you don't have any credits. There's so many people who want to work on records in some capacity, producers, mixers, engineers, whatever. And if you're coming at it, you don't have a lot of credits. You just need to get out there. You need to meet people, which the easiest way to meet people is in sessions, getting picked up for gigs. That gets you in a room, that interfaces you with artists, producers, whoever. And because you just never know. I mean, it's pretty trite to even say it at this point, but it's such a thing in Los Angeles. You'll meet people your first year here and then never hear from them. And then 8 years later, cross paths somehow. And, you run into someone you met, and then that turns into a thing. The next thing you know, you're mixing something that they did. You just never know where any of this stuff goes. I mean, it's so nonlinear.
But what about for people who, I feel like there's a lot of people out there who go into this thinking, I want to be niche down. I want to be the guy who's, really good at making metal music or something like that.
Sure.
Do you still think that applies? To, just to say yes to everything, even if it's not in the style of music that maybe they want to eventually get into?
Maybe, maybe not. I mean, it depends on, are you doing this for, are you recording metal bands, but then you also have another job or a gig, and the metal thing just is, that's what you do and you only work on that music, but it's maybe not your primary source of income. In that situation, sure, yeah, then just do it, and that's your thing. That's what you focus on. Sometimes it's not as easy as that. And especially I think some of it comes down to, I found myself in plenty of rooms that I either didn't belong in, or it was so far outside of my own taste palette, but you still learn a ton. I've worked on some bigger pop things, and each time it's like a wild learning experience. So for me, it has proven to be pretty positive advice, or pretty sound advice to just be open, say yes to as much as you can, up to a certain point, right? I'm not saying do it your whole career, but yes, starting out, I think it's important to be as open-minded as possible as far as what your thing is that you work on. Because there's a ton of, I would say the majority of the people that I know who have had successful careers as producers, mixers, or whatever, their own personal taste and what they like and what they often work on do not always coalesce. And that goes with everybody. And you kind of need to be cool with that, I think, to some degree. to be like a working, whatever, record maker.
Yeah, I think if you're busy enough, then you can obviously say no to things.
Without a doubt, of course.
Yeah. But it's just a matter of like getting there to begin with and learning along the way.
Yeah. And definitely at this point, when projects come in, like listen to them pretty closely, and depending on whether it's production or mixing, just listen to it, figure out whether it makes sense to do or not. And so now I've gotten to a point where I can be a little pickier, but when you're 25 years old and you have no real notable credits, I think you're doing yourself a disservice by like snubbing your nose at something because it doesn't perfectly align with what you're into. I think that's a recipe for a short career.
Yeah. Well, the other thing I see too is like, in addition to people who are focused on niching, is just, and this is something that applies a lot more to like people getting started, is that like early on, you're not as confident in your skills. You're not as confident in like the quality of work that you can do. So I think a lot of people are just afraid to say yes to things because they feel like they aren't ready for it. So I'm curious to get your advice on like, what advice do you have for people who are in that position? Like as far as doing it scared and like saying yes to opportunities when you feel like you're not ready.
So I have run into that in like having like assistance on certain gigs, or like maybe hiring someone for editing or something. I have run into that thing where it's maybe someone said yes to something and turns out that like I shouldn't have hired them to like edit drums for me or whatever it is. And that can be a little bit aggravating as the person hiring someone. So if you're gonna say yes, try to prepare yourself as much as possible, or make sure that, it's something that you're fairly certain you can do. Again, I think that's why it's so important, going back to what I was saying about just starting out and like having access to a studio and being able to like bring in bands to the studio and record. I screwed up a lot of records that way. I was not qualified to like produce a band's album at 23 years old, but I was charging like nothing. I was probably making, $80 and paying the studio what I could for the time. And so that was the trade-off. It was like, and that was my experience going to Philly to work with a friend. Like he got paid nothing, but it was a way for him to learn, like make a record with someone. And it was a great opportunity for us to go to a studio that we had no business being in. So that's the other thing that comes from those experiences. Yeah, you probably are going to like screw up some recording. That's a given. Of course it's going to happen. But you learn, and it's kind of low stakes for a lot of people. But in doing so, you learn how to do all the boring parts of record making that no one really wants to do, but it's jobs that have to be, editing drums and, tuning vocals and all the boring bits of the job that aren't sexy, but you got to be good at doing them. And especially if you get to that point where now you're hiring an assistant, you go like, hey, I got like this much. Can you like edit drums for a few songs? And someone says yes, and they screw up the edits. Now it's like, okay, well, that was a pretty fair like rate, and I just needed this to be done and done right, and now I'm redoing it, and so now I'm a little annoyed. So say yes to as many opportunities as possible, and if it's something where you think it's outside of your skill set, get better at the skill set, or don't say yes.
Yep. I agree with that. Or just be transparent about it, I think.
Or just be totally open about it and say like, I'll try. I don't really know. And in some cases, like that's fine. Or if I had something and if I'm sending it to somebody, just say like, yeah, take it as far as you can. I'll cover the rest. Whatever.
Yeah. I think there's definitely like, it's understanding the stakes for the person that's hiring you as well, right? Like if it's low stakes and you're transparent with them, maybe they'll give you a shot. If it's something that's high stakes, they're going to appreciate your honesty and maybe say, okay, for this project, you're not going to be the right fit, but I got something else that maybe you are.
Absolutely. And is it something that I need to do this right away and it needs to be right. I need to turn it around quickly. Or like, is there wiggle room? If there's wiggle room, I'm like, sure. And then I'll try to teach as best as I can, but I'm admittedly a pretty terrible teacher. I try to be better at it. I use the same assistant who I've been using for years, a guy named Gao, and he's wonderful. And so I can send it to him. I know it's going to be right if it's editing or prepping stuff or things like that. But yeah, you just have to be patient with people if they don't land something the first time. For me, it's like think back to whenever I was getting hired by producers, like probably screwed stuff up and they were probably cool about it. And like a light slap on the wrist or like if anything, like a text like, hey, don't do that, whatever it was. And then you keep going. And that's how you get better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, love it. Well, let's move forward from those early days and talk about kind of your approach these days. And I want to focus on your mixes because, man, you're an amazing mixer. I love the work that you're doing.
Oh, thank you.
When it comes to starting on a project, what's your normal mindset going into a new project? How do you start? What do you start? What are you listening for? That kind of thing.
I think the biggest thing right out of the gate is like it's a conversation with the artist, the producer, the A&R, whoever I'm like interfacing with, and trying to figure out like what mixing is to them in this particular scenario, because I mix a lot of records. What I do on the records varies drastically from project to project. The credit might always be mixing, but what it is changes so much. And I think that's the same for everybody. It's just different projects need different things. Different artists view that process as different things. So I think early on, like right out of the gate, it's figuring out what kind of project is this? Is this one where everyone's pretty stoked on the rough, but let's make it sound better? You know, that's one side of the spectrum where you're operating in like these more minute surgical margins in terms of like what can be changed, what can't. And then on the other end of the spectrum, it's like you have carte blanche to like cut out 16 bars if you see fit. You know, that's the other side of it. So just getting a barometer of what kind of mixed project it is and what the artist or producer or whoever is hoping to get out of it. Because it just changes so much and you can be so far off the mark, particularly nowadays if you don't pay attention to that detail. If you just go in and you're like mixer guy and you're just going to go in and you're going to do your thing, you're going to change stuff, and the way the reverb they used sounds stupid, so you're going to change it because you know better. You're going to get canned from more gigs than you can imagine. So you have to go, and sometimes you can do that, but you just need to be really careful in figuring out like what kind of a project it is.
Yeah. So then as far as like preserving some of the stuff that was maybe good in the rough, like are you working from the original sessions that they made the rough mixes from, or are you kind of just starting fresh and trying to recreate what they started with?
I try not to start totally over. I always like I want to pick up where someone leaves off in the rough. Like if I can work from their session, I will, and I like doing that. Otherwise, if it's something where maybe it was like in Logic and I get stems, I just have like I have like a delivery sheet that goes out about like the best way to send files. And I try to start, again, this is where having an assistant comes in, where everything will be organized in a way where it's like, I'm normally working off mostly the wet stems, except on the vocal, but I have both there so that I can decide which is which or what I should use or whatever. But I try to pick up from where someone left off. And if there's something that I'm just like, I know I can get these drums better if I redo all the processing on them, that I go back to the dries. Same with vocals. It's nice working off of a session because often it's just, there's something nagging you about something in a vocal that cheapens it or does something that you don't like or whatever. It's often as simple as just finding a culprit and bypassing it. But again, just trying to be really mindful with all those decisions and not go into it with any sort of like arrogance that like I know what's better because like I'm the mixer. Like there might be something that to me sounds like wild, right? Like it could be I don't know. It could be I don't love fast attacks on vocals. There's one thing. Maybe there's a song where it's like 3 compressors and they're all the fastest they can be. And it sounds crazy to me. My guess often is like, if I go ahead and right out of the gate, just get rid of all those and do it my way, the very first note's going to be like, hey, the vocal sounds weird. So then it's okay. What is it about that thing that they're doing that they probably like? And how can I do that in a way that's better or more pleasing? So it's just going into it with as much respect for what somebody did before me while still making sure that I'm bringing some value. I don't want to just like sit there and twiddle my thumbs and send it and be, annoyed by it and send it right back sounding exactly the same. I need to, then it's my job to, okay, how do I preserve that thing that they like, but maybe mitigate the sound that is annoying to me as a result of it or something like that, so it just changes so drastically. And then, like I said, another project, it'll be the opposite where it's, hey, why don't you just take everything off and just start over and do your thing?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a totally separate, it's virtually a different job, it feels like, it's so drastically different. But that's the world of mixing, my experience, at least in 2024. That's the spectrum of what you're expected to be able to do.
That makes a lot of sense. And I can definitely see how when you're working off of someone else's session, it takes a certain level of confidence in your abilities, but also a certain level of being able to drop your ego to like you said, like accept that like they've made a conscious decision to keep something a certain way. And so knowing what to keep and what you can get away with changing, like that's going to be a matter of communication with the artist and just also just, really being attentive to like what is the magic of the song and what is important.
Yeah. Like, oh, they're using a reverb that I don't like. That's fine. Maybe I can do something cool to it. Maybe I don't need to do anything to it. Or maybe I do something and then they get back and there's a note about like the reverb from the rough. So we just go back. And I think that's one of the reasons, historically, when like mixing became like a real standalone process, you 15, 20, I guess starting with like Clear Mountain, but it was always like older people were mixers, right? It was like folks who had a path of having made a lot of records, and then they, at a certain point, they focused primarily on mixing. And for me, it has been kind of just like an organic thing. There was never like a conscious like I'm a mixer. It just sort of, that's how it happened. But I think my point is with a lot of that stuff, you need some years behind you. You need to have made some records to get to a point where every project you open up, you don't go into it with this sort of like egoic, I'm going to really like change stuff and I'm going to do my thing. Like a chip that you have like, I don't want to say something to prove, but you go in a little bit over eager. And I definitely did that when I was younger, starting to get mix gigs, like just changing too much or changing too much on projects that didn't require it. Because it's just this balance of knowing when to go in and have some ego and like make some bold moves. If you don't have some bold moves, you don't end up with stuff that sounds like, Dave Fridman or Philip Sadar or any of these like great mixers that are just like aggressive and heavy-handed and make stuff that's wildly exciting. So you need to have some of that. You just need to have the tact to know when it's applicable and when it is not.
Of course. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, one thing that I was curious to ask you about when it came to your process, and I think this is like where most people start with their mixes, is kind of setting up their levels in a track and maybe getting like the rough mix kind of established for themselves. And one of the things I found like when I was listening to your music, hopefully this isn't coming across the wrong way, but like I felt like I could hear that when it comes to level setting, you tend to prioritize, like, every mix kind of has priorities in it. And I feel like you do a great job with like having vocals that are like really in front of the mix. And I kind of felt like I would always hear vocals loud, and then there would always be some sort of like instrumental melodic element that was like responsible for the vibe of a track, and then you can hear all the other instruments kind of underneath that. And I was just curious, like, if that is generally how you like to prioritize your process with setting levels, or I mean, like in those cases, like, I was listening to things like Father John Misty or the Phosphorescent records, where like they are very vibe heavy records, and so those elements are in the front.
Absolutely. Again, I mean, the most boring answer is it depends project to project, but I like loud vocals. I just, there are certain things in mixes that I feel like there's no such thing as it being too loud. There's personal taste, but like, I like a loud vocal. Particularly in those two instances, like a Father John record or a Phosphorescent record or something, like it's such a lyric heavy thing that I'm spending most of my time on projects like that, making sure that you never lose a lyric or an articulation of a word or anything. I'm spending way more time doing that than I am, doinking around with a compressor or anything. Just like really, really laser focused on those things. So I do like loud vocals often, but that said, like, you learn really quickly when you start working with people like Phosphorescent, for instance, where I know from having done a record with them where I like a vocal, or where I would naturally like close my eyes and place it in the mix. Matthew probably wants it like a dB and a half or 2 dB louder than that. So I just, you start working on a project together, and then you develop that really quickly. Like, okay, this sounds good to me. Let me turn it up another 2 dB and he's going to love it. And it sounds great, and it doesn't feel too loud. And then based on that, that's when you can kind of figure out where the other things live in reference to where that vocal lives. And of course, like,
Gotcha. Where
your snare drum lives changes your perception of how loud a vocal is and all of that stuff. So yeah, I want to hear on records that are very singer-songwriter oriented, which is a lot of what I tend to work on. Yeah, I want to hear every lyric.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess a better way of asking that question would have been like, as far as prioritizing the elements in a mix, like how do you go about deciding that level balance and making sure that something feels like it's got the depth to it, but it also has like a well-balanced frequency curve to the entire mix, that kind of thing?
I don't know. I wish I had some sort of like, well, I do this, and then I do this, and then I do this, and then by 4 o'clock I have a mix and maybe some people do. I'm playing around, moving stuff, trying to, if it's a dense track or a dense production, trying to get a sense of depth via like the snare and the vocal being loud. And then that sometimes you can get away with like a soupier mix, or like there's a lot of like harmonic elements, strings and slide and all kinds of like legato stuff that's going to eat up a lot of real estate. Like sometimes you can get away with some of that soupiness if you play with that dynamic of how loud a snare is and how loud a vocal is. But yeah, the honest answer is just moving stuff around, playing with it constantly until it just sort of starts sitting and feels good, and it's working a bus compressor in the way that you want it to, that sounds musical. And as far as like harmonics stuff or like prioritizing other things, like I always want to really clearly hear the thing that's sort of like I guess you would say like the harmonic center of what a track is. If it's a acoustic guitar or a piano or whatever, I want to hear that, and I want it to stay present. I don't want to have it just be like drums, bass, and vocal, heavy, muscular kind of thing. I want to hear like the harmonic content of what's happening.
That makes sense. Well, that was one of the things that I found like really interesting listening to your portfolio is that like a lot of your mixes, like they have a lot of vibe to them. There's a lot of atmosphere to them. And um it seems like it's a very intentional approach to how you handle the levels in your mixes to achieve that kind of thing. And it seems like, whether the mixes are very like cathedral like or if they're super dry and slappy, like there's been a decision about how to create that vibe in the mix. And so I was curious to know about like how do you go about establishing the vibe of a production and picking the right effects to achieve that?
Yeah, a lot of it's just like kind of instinct, but a lot of it is like I like really heavy-handed stuff. Just like even just as a list, I like really bold, direct things. Like if something's dry, I love stuff that's like in super dry, like nothing, just nothing on it. Growing up, I think most people who work on records are like big Nigel Godrich fans. At least in my mind, it's like the creme de la creme of engineer producers, and Radiohead was obviously wildly influential to me. And I think listening to those records, it's like there's no like mild choice. It's bold. And so if like there's a slap, there's a lot of slap. If there's like a dense verb, it's pretty dense. And then maybe it sucks back. So I think generally I like that kind of heavy-handedness again when it's called for or when it's allowed for. I don't want to, I think just process-wise and maybe personality-wise, I've never been like a real like squint my eyes and really like play with like I like the feeling of very heavy-handed, like you're throwing paint, and that keeps it fun for me. And then invariably this is kind of like when you're nearing the end of a mix or it's feeling good or a production is feeling or whatever is when you throw all the paint and then you get to a point where okay, now you're making the tiny 1-2 dB moves and you can really hear the difference. That to me has always been the sign of like, okay, we've hit the point where everything from here on is just taste and preference, but I know that the balance is right because now I can hear a 1 dB change in the bass or whatever it is. Because very early in the process, like I'm just pretty very like Neanderthal, just like moving stuff and doing things and what works, what doesn't. And when you're in that mode, you can make like wild changes and often the difference feels negligible. But then when you start fine tuning and it starts coalescing into something that's like working as a thing, that's when you tell you're nearing the end.
Yeah. Well, as far as like going to the extremes with effects and stuff like that, one thing I've heard some people argue that is a good approach to mixing. Not that there's a right or wrong way to do any of this stuff, but like I've heard some people say if you're going to send something to a reverb, send everything to the reverb so it all sounds cohesive. And then there's other people who are like, screw that, like, different elements can have their own effects and live in their own world. What's your take on that?
I often do both, depending on the thing, depending on my role. I generally have like a series of, whatever, a spring, a plate, a room, a chamber. And then just for ease of stuff, I just send it in just for straight up like CPU processing so that Pro Tools doesn't screw me, so it doesn't freak out when I'm printing a mix. I generally have, like a finite number of things. But then that said, something will come up and I'll just put there are certain reverbs that I like a lot that often it's easier just to use them directly on something and it's its own thing. And I write a lot of automation, pretty like, I don't want to say obsessed, but that's probably the thing I do the most is like, I'm automating a lot of plugins a lot of times. And so in those instances, it's often easier just for me to, if I, need a particular effect, just dupe it and put a verb on it and quickly automate it and cut it off, and then there you have dynamic going into a section or something. So it just depends. But generally speaking, I start out with like a few reverbs, a few delays, a chorus of some kind, or H3000 or whatever. And I use some hardware in one of the. I'll use hardware effects on certain projects. That's one of the things I like to come out of the box for and actually touch something and move real controls on a delay or something to get it to sit, as opposed to just automatically putting it on eighth note. I feel like, and this could just be in my head, but when you do it by ear, it's a little out of time. It just sits better. It's not going to land where the snare is. You know what I mean? It's just ever so slightly out of. It's not perfect,
That's an interesting approach. I never thought about it that way, but it makes sense that like if it is slightly off, like you could be creating more of a pocket for a snare to live on its own, as opposed to hearing a snare and the delay of whatever it is. It is creating a little bit of space. So I guess it all depends on like how far off the beat is.
Yeah. I don't want everything to sound like a dub record, but using like there's so many plugins in the box that sound so good that I don't feel like I need racks of outboard. I use an outboard compressor and a couple outboard pieces on the mix, but I do like having individual effects that are outboard that I can tap into if I need them. I like having a real tape slap, even if it's just in my head, even if no one else hears a marked difference. I want to have something this is just mine. This isn't, we all can't buy this for $39.99 on Black Friday. Like I have a cassette that I like to slap on, and it's just mine. I like that, just as bringing something that's unique, because we all have the same tools. Everyone has the same stuff. We all see the same videos of people using this similar stuff, and I use it all too. So like a lot of it too is just me X number of years into a career, like just wanting to stay sharp and inspired, I guess, and not just come into the studio and do the same thing day in, day out. Like,
yeah, keeps it fun, keeps it different.
It's gotta be, you have to. So yeah, that's the thought process behind having like some, using real effects when you can.
Love it. Well, you talked earlier about how you love having big vocals and having the vocals be like often in front in the mix. And that is one of the things that I think you do an amazing job with, is getting your vocals to sound really clear and very focused for the listener. So as far as like getting that clarity with the vocal and getting it to sit out in the mix and be clear, what are some of your tips for achieving that?
Controlling. That's such a dumb answer. Control. But like controlling the low mid of the vocal, controlling the harshness of it, and trying to do, I think about this a lot, like trying to do, I guess, as much work on stuff around the vocal so that I can do less directly to it. Particularly do you know what I mean? Like if there's
like automating other things to get out of the way.
Get out of its way. Yeah. Don't mess with the vocal, mess with the other thing that's stepping on it, and try to leave it as natural as possible. It happens all the time, but when you start getting rid of stuff, so long as it's recorded with like a decent mic or a decent chain or whatever, and obviously it's a pleasant singer, a pleasant voice is ideal. But if you just remove a lot of stuff from it, and like compress it a little bit, and then just start like controlling little bits, it sounds really, they often just sound so much better than if you start just throwing the kitchen sink and changing stuff and adding a soothe and 4 de-essers and all this stuff. Like I use a de-esser, I do a lot of it by hand, and just do the least amount possible. If it's a situation like what we were talking about, where it's like a singer-songwriter sort of thing, and you need a big vocal that's out front and loud, try to do less to it and do more to everything surrounding it.
I think that's a really good point because I think a lot of people tend to focus on like if there's an element that they want to fix in a mix, they think that they need to process that element further. And it's so true that like a lot of times it's like that element may already sound great. If it's a vocal, it might already sound great the way it is. It just needs like a little top end out of the cymbals or something like that to make that pocket.
Yeah. Or, I mean, if my, like a Father John Misty session would be a good example of like, it's psychotic how broken down the vocal gets. Like, I might have 20 tracks because it's split up. Just this phrase, like, it's a little too close, but I don't want to take low mid out of the whole vocal. So it's just split that's on a new track. And then it's just, there's a slightly different EQ there that's just dealing with it in the pre. And most of my sessions are generally that way, where it's that's like an extreme case where it really changes because he's so dynamic and he gets so loud and so quiet, and so it's really broken down. But most of my sessions, generally, it's like the sections of the song are all split up, and sometimes more split up than others. I want to be able to control sections without globally doing something. If that makes sense?
Yeah, but so instead of using automation, then like you're literally breaking everything down into individual tracks and having kind of settings for those lines or whatever.
Yeah, that's just straight up out of laziness on my end. Like, it's easier just to dupe it, and then it's like, okay, the pre-chorus has its own track, and then like, sends, or I can do a different thing on a send there without writing automation or whatever. But it just makes it so that I can split them up because the voice always changes as the song goes on, like most of the time. Sometimes it doesn't, but most of the time it's like higher register in the chorus. So like, I don't want to take out a bunch of, I like low mid, I like some of the mud that a lot of people tend to dip out. I like that. I like roundness to things. So I don't want to take that out if a singer's going higher in the register, but if they're lower in the register, I might need to control it a little bit. It's just stuff like that. Just,
that makes sense.
And all of it comes back to trying to make it sound like I'm doing nothing, trying to make it sound the most like no trickery is happening is kind of the end result, particularly on the more singer-songwriter stuff. I want it to sound like there's no trickery, just sounds like someone singing. And sometimes you need to get real clever.
Yeah. And I would think from an organizational standpoint too, breaking things out into the individual tracks that way could also just help you visualize, okay, this is what's happening in like something's happening in the pre-choruses, or there's a difference in the settings, as opposed to sometimes when you like automate plugins, you don't really see what's happening. It's kind of it's just functioning in the background, right?
Oh, it bites me all the time where I forget that, like, end of the day, I like did this, I quickly automated something, and then like 2 revisions later, I realized I did it, and it like caused all of this headache. So yeah, often it's easier just to do that. But like I said, I still work pretty quickly. So sometimes it's just automating. Sometimes it's doing this. Sometimes it's just this one time in the chorus where this thing happens and it's annoying my ear. So I'll just automate like a pro cue to snap it, or whatever. So yeah, it just depends. But
yeah. Absolutely. Well, we kind of talked about this a little bit, but I'd love to dig a little deeper into the Phosphorescent Revelator record that you made, because that record to me, it sounds really awesome. Like it's just like such a lush sounding record. And I felt like listening to that record, like it felt immersive, even though it wasn't an immersive mix that I was listening to. Like I felt like I was like in the mix, which I think is a very hard thing to achieve. And a lot of it has to do with everything we talked about, like setting your levels and how you're automating things. Like I could tell, but I'd love to learn a little bit more about like the process of making that record and some of your like philosophies going into mixing that record.
It was a long process, but it was like wildly fun and rewarding. And Matthew, how Phosphorescent is just like the sweetest, nicest dude. So it was like really long process, but really enjoyable because he's just like a lovely guy to talk to. And like, we would talk like every day for like 2 months working on it. It was one of the longer mix projects I've been a part of. That's one where, like, I was saying earlier when we talked where like the spectrum of what is expected out of a mix varies so much project to project. That was one where it was like I had license to be pretty heavy handed, and it was like it was invited to do that. So like there was a ton of, I think almost every song, maybe not every song, but most songs there was like obviously your general layout, drums, bass, guitars, but then there would be strings, a pedal steel, and something else that was one of those like Therevox things. It's like a glide kind of synth thing. So very like legato, lush sounds that all sound fantastic, but then there would just be a lot of it. And so early on in the process, Matthew and everyone kind of, like I said, gave me like go in and like move some stuff, like do some things. So like the first sort of iteration of mixing was not a lot of like sonics, not really like mixing. Like I wasn't where it was like like arranging percussion stuff, arranging strings. Okay, there's this sort of like melodic build up here where like at the end of this bar, pedal steel guy and strings are both doing lines and we got to pick one or the other. And then it just became this real collaborative thing of I would do these really heavy handed, like just get rid of whatever thing. And then Matthew and I would go back and forth. So it was sort of like we're mixing and it's sonic stuff, obviously, because you're mixing an album. But very early on, it was like more arrangement stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really fun. It was difficult. We were doing it remotely. He's in Nashville and I'm out here. We would just go back and forth doing those arrangement things. So a lot of the like lushness of that record, and one of the things I'm really proud of about it is like it sounds really clear. Like you can really isolate all the things that are happening, but there's a lot of stuff still going on. So it feels big and dreamy and immersive. But like I talked about earlier, his vocals really loud and the snare is normally pretty loud. So you still get this like depth and you get this clarity. You know, I don't think we went through and took out a ton of like too much stuff where it sounds sparse by any means, but it's just arranged quite well so that we're really highlighting and taking our time. And I'd make a move and he'd be like, no, you know, nix the steel instead and let's juice the strings there. And or we would just do that constantly, like pretty forensically with all this playing. And it was all great playing and you're just like picking the cream of the crop and sort of just highlighting what you have room to highlight sort of around the vocal as you're going. So we did that for like 6 weeks or something remotely. It was before I moved into this studio. I was renting a studio in North Hollywood. And then he came out and we finished the record at Sunset Sound.
Cool. That's awesome. I think that's like, it's cool to hear you talk about how like such a big part of that record was, or the mixing process was like stripping stuff out. Cause it's a perfect example of how like you can still achieve bigness and make a mix feel immersive and wide and have the depth and all that stuff, but without having to like have everything playing all at once. Like sometimes simplicity gets you there.
You can make it bigger, like straight up. It can sound bigger just with less stuff. But also the magic of it and what's so great about him and his ear and his production, I think on his old records, things that I didn't work on is like there generally is like there's a lot of there, at least it sounds dense and massive and kind of maximalist. And that's where he and like the Father John records are similar. Like I like stuff that's pretty maximalist, you know. The Misty records or the stuff I've done with Jonathan Wilson, like it's maximum. There's a lot of stuff and it's all great playing, but then invariably part of that process becomes like really forensic, like arrangement stuff of, okay, what are we highlighting and when? And then, yeah, that's how we did that one. The Phosphorescent record was difficult, but I'm really proud of it. I love the way it turned out. I loved working with him. Yeah, really happy about that one.
That's awesome. You talked about mixing it remotely. What were you using to do that?
I don't think we really stream. I stream with people pretty often, just like audio movers, I offer that as an option. I don't think we did. I can't really remember. It was like a pretty hectic period for a number of reasons, but I think it was just like get into the studio, send mixes. All right, he'd call me, we'd talk through stuff, and then just. But it was like still really collaborative for like I said, 6 weeks or something, and then he finally came out, and we finished it at sunset. That was good, just to like. We split it out, we put it through a desk, we did all that, printed it to tape, replaced some stuff with hardware, kept some stuff over the hardware. But there is just a big record like that, a hard record. There's a nice aspect to it of it's on desk. It sounds pretty similar to where it was before it went to the desk. Like we had done a lot of work. Some songs we did more work, some songs we basically just put it on the desk, hit record on the tape machine, and printed it. But there's a feeling you get printing a record like through a console to tape that you will never get doing it this way. Whether sonically there's any sort of magic or voodoo, it's another conversation. But working on a big record like that was difficult to finish. It feels final. It feels like there's this. It's hard to explain, but there's like a weird like nervousness where you're like, all right, I'm gonna print. All right, are we good? Like, are we good? Is the vocal good? Like, do you want to?
There's no going back. Yeah.
Yeah, like I'm hitting print, and now obviously you can always go back. Like it's not that big. It's just music. You can always change something. But I like that mild stress of like, all right, this is it. There we go. It makes everything feel like really important.
Yeah. What was it like working in your home studio and making a mix there and then taking it to Sunset? Because I imagine that switching rooms would drastically change your perception of a mix.
It was so weird. It was really weird. It wasn't a home studio. I was renting a studio in North Hollywood that we had like built out, and so it was treated, and it sounded quite good, and I mixed a lot of stuff there, so I knew that room. And I think I had worked at Sunset like once before, but never in Studio A. It sounded real weird. Yeah, I have no other way to, like, I had to just resist a lot of urges to change, to pull it up and start changing things. And that was weird. In hindsight, I should have brought my own speakers, but I think I had just gotten back in town, and then he was flying in. We were just gonna it was just a fast time. It was just like kind of down and dirty. Like I brought my mix rack, I brought all the outboard I was using. We did it, and if something was really sounded off, just know that we're already at like revision 10. I know how this record sounds. I know it sounds the way that, generally speaking, like whatever the prowess and Studio A are telling me, don't pay total attention to it. Yeah. And that was really difficult. That was really difficult. And I really don't like headphones. So I have like a nice pair that I know and sound really good, but I just hate wearing headphones. And that was a situation where it was like, before you're like, oh, I need to add like 10 dB of low end or whatever, drastic things that you just are hearing differently all of a sudden. Take a beat, put on headphones. And yeah, I mean, Studio A at Sunset is fantastic. It's awesome. But a lot of, it's a classic studio. It's in one of the best in Los Angeles. It doesn't mean that it has a perfect control room that sounds, exactly precise. So you need to go into it with there's like a reverence for like this magical place with this incredible one-of-a-kind console, and countless records have been there and all this stuff. But then go in and be like, I think my low end is more accurate in my studio in North Hollywood.
Fair.
Or maybe it's not more accurate. I know it better. Maybe it's just that I know it better. It's not, I'm in no way saying that I had a better room than Sunset A, but you need to go in and yeah, just like kind of slap your own hand from changing too much. But it was definitely that was weird. it was weird to spend that much time, because it wasn't like we did like one or two mixes, then we went and we did it on a console. I mean, we were working on this album for 4 or 6 weeks before going to do this. So it was like, I've heard these a lot.
Yeah. Well, it just speaks a lot to your confidence level in the rooms that you work in, and like understanding the gear that you've been mixing on, to know like, okay, I'm in a new place right now. I shouldn't mess with this, despite the fact that like I'm in this holy grail place. Like, what I came here with was sounding
quite good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there was, like I was saying before, I think that's just where like time making records comes into it, because it would have been really easy to go in there and just like replace everything that I had with like every piece of hardware. And I replaced a lot. And then there was some stuff where it was like, this thing's not making this. I want to use this because I've never used this, like whatever. I think one of the pieces was like this GML compressor or something. I was like, I want to use this because I know Congleton loves this thing, so I'm going to use it, and using it and being like, I don't like this. I'm just going to use the plugin. It's fine. And just having the 26, 27-year-old me, I think would have wasted a lot of people's time messing around with like the gear and not just listening to what was coming out of the speakers and making sure that I was doing stuff that was making an actual difference.
Yeah. Well, I think that like for people listening to this, some people might listen to this and think like, well, I'm not planning on taking my mixes to a different studio or something like that. But I think that this still holds very true for people who are doing like the car test or, whatever, like where you're just listening on a different set of speakers that you maybe aren't super familiar with. And then those paint a different picture of the mix. And so you feel this inclination to have to change things up because this new speaker that you're not familiar with tells you it sounds different. I think there is something to be said for just like really trusting the gear that you have and taking confidence in that and leaning into that more than like trying out a million different systems and different rooms and whatnot, just to see how it sounds in different rooms and making decisions based on that.
I don't think I'll ever stop like chasing like the monitor thing. Not necessarily the monitor itself, but just like building a room that sounds good and having nice monitors or different sets. Like that's the one everyone I know that works on it is always like chasing this like imaginary of like perfect translation, right? It's like the most maddening part of the job. It's like, you just want it so bad. You just want speakers that sound, you make a thing and it sounds like this on these speakers and it sounds that way everywhere. For everybody. It's like the dream. It's what everybody wants. I think I'm closer now than I've ever been. That said, I think that is just something. I'll be 50 years old. I'll still just be like doinking around with new speakers, just trying to get closer and closer and closer.
Yeah, I think there's some like mythical things in mixing that people chase, and that's definitely one of them.
Oh, it's not going anywhere. Yeah, for ages and ages and ages, and you kind of need to just like occasionally zoom out and realize that like people were making better records than I've made on like NS10s and Pro X for years. The stuff I have, if I can't make something that sounds really good on what I have right now, then like it's on me. It's not, that's on me. I do the multiple speaker thing, and I think it's really important to like the forced perspective shift when you're working on stuff, like whether it's listening in a car or I listen on my phone a lot. I have a Sonos in here that's just like off to the side of me. So it's basically mono, it's just playing. I can switch to it and then I just hear it like you would hear music at home. And that's so valuable. Nobody listens to records sitting in front of like, $10,000 or $20,000 speakers, like with their eyes closed, squinting for like the Phantom Center. You know what I mean? No one listens that way. We do. But most people do not. And me, whenever I'm not working, they're like, I have music playing on my phone while I'm cooking, So it's important to zoom out as much as possible and try to think about it that way without getting lackadaisical and, ceasing to care.
Of course. Yeah. So then at the end of the day, like ultimately what makes a great mix in your mind?
What makes a great mix? That's a great, a perfect mix just doesn't exist. A great mix, I want to hear everything. I want it to be as out of the way in a way as like where I don't even think about it as like, if it's like a singer-songwriter sort of record, like what we've been talking about, where it's like, you're not even really thinking about anything technical going on. It just sounds like music. I can count on one hand, but my favorite records that I've personally been a part of are the ones that when all is said and done and they're out and I listen to it, it just feels like it has existed like without my involvement. It just plays back so organically. And I feel that way about the Phosphorescent record. I feel in a handful of them where you get the vinyl after it's out and you put it on and you can just listen to it and not hear any of the work. And ironically, most of those records tend to be like the hardest records I've ever been a part of, where you can put it on and you hear that the work that went into it was to make it sound like it has just existed without interference from someone. So I think those are great. And then on the total opposite side, a lot of the stuff I like is a great mix. It's really bold. Like I love Dave Fridman and Philip Zadar and Nigel Godrich. Those are the guys that were in my head, like they're just heavy. It's bold. It's not mild. And I think there's a lot of people who are carrying that now. Those were the folks for me when I was starting out that I was always really excited listening to stuff they had worked on for those reasons. It's just bold. And there are mistakes. It's not perfect. It's not like tied up in like a nice little box and everything's sounds sonically pristine. It's a little rude.
Love it, man. I think that's a great spot to wrap up. If people want to learn more about you or, potentially work with you or reach out to you somehow, like what's the best way for them to do that?
Probably either my website, which is just my name at .com or whatever, or Instagram. I'm not the most social media heavy person by any means, but I'm there. I check messages, and both places you can also find, my managers on there, but you can email either of us. I'm very open to talking to people. And even if it's something that I end up not working on, like I try to always listen and just be cool about it. Yeah.
Love that, man. Well, Dave, thank you so much for being on the podcast again.
Thank you for having me.
Really appreciate your time and learning more about your process. And you've been making amazing records, so it's always good to get some insight into what goes into those. So thank you.
I appreciate it very much. And yeah, thanks for having me. It's just fun.
Of course. So that was my interview with Dave Cerminara, and I really enjoyed learning more about his process on getting his tracks to feel so big, but also keep the vocals focused and have those really big and clear. And I loved what he talked about there as far as how to get your vocals sounding clear, but without actually doing any processing to the vocals. Because I think instinctively, a lot of people think that they have to add processing to the track that they want to get clarity on, or that they want to make bigger in a mix. But really, it does come down to sometimes just stripping things back and either removing tracks altogether, or maybe it's cutting some frequencies on another track. But all of those other elements in the mix are going to be fighting your vocal. So it's a matter of prioritizing, what is the important element in the vocal, and then figuring out where to cut from other instruments or mute things and that kind of stuff. So I love that he talked about that, because I think it's such an important thing, so that you don't just instinctively start processing your tracks. Because I can almost guarantee you that if you start doing that, you're going to start having to apply way more processing to other tracks to kind of make up for your moves. So it is about being strategic here. And I think that the way he outlined in this episode is a really great way to do it. And I also enjoyed learning about his early days and his emphasis on speed. I think that that's also another really important thing to think about. We often figure that if you want to be in this industry, you need to know how to be an engineer and how to mic things up and use some software. And yes, that's all really important. But it's not just about learning that stuff. That's kind of a given these days, right? You have to be really efficient at what you do. And so I love what he shared at the beginning about diving into keyboard shortcuts and really getting good at being fast so that people aren't waiting for you and so that you can make your sessions run more efficiently. That really goes a long way. And even at a home studio level, if you're recording local artists, you still need to work really fast. And why wouldn't you want to work faster, right? It helps keep your creativity and it helps keep your focus so that you're not distracted by looking through menus, trying to find things, that kind of stuff. So I love what he shared here about using keyboard shortcuts and really focusing on that speed. So I hope that you were able to take some great tips from this episode. And if you did, please make sure to subscribe to the podcast. That way you're notified about all new episodes as they go live, because we've got tons of other great stuff coming up ahead, and I don't want you to miss out. So make sure to subscribe. And if you're struggling with your mixes and you're not quite sure what to be doing to get the sounds that you hear in your head to come out of your speakers, or you're not sure about what to be doing with the software, or how to work more efficiently and cut your mix time down in half, or just feel more confident in your ability to record things properly, edit them properly, and mix them properly. If you're looking for one-on-one help with that, inside of my coaching program, Amplitude, that is exactly what I do. I work one-on-one with my students to help make sure that their vision for their tracks comes to life and that they have the clarity and a process to follow to execute on that and make sure that their tracks sound every bit as good as they've always wanted. So if you're interested in learning more about that program, make sure to visit masteryourmix.com/amplitude, and you can find all the details on that page there. Last but not least, I want to give a very special shout out to our podcast sponsor, Samply. Samply is an awesome app that makes the process of collaborating with other musicians super easy. And if you're dealing with things like mix revisions and organizing people's notes, Samply really streamlines the process. So make sure to check them out online at samply.app. And with that said, we've reached the end of this episode. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end. Can't wait to chat with you in the next one. We'll talk soon. Take care. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. Please make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app and leave a review. If you have any questions or comments for the podcast, send an email to questions@masteryourmix.com. And for more information on how to create pro recordings from your home studio, visit masteryourmix.com.